Do you believe there are portals within the natural world? Portals that lead to parallel places or other dimensions? Do fairy folk live on the other side? Or do they dwell right here beside us? G'day, I'm Kitty. Welcome to Fairy Encounters. It's easy to imagine fairy portals as places deep in an ethereal woodlands or forest, or beside a bubbling river. You know, real Tinkerbell stuff. But these places, portals we call them, places marking between worlds, where we can have one foot in our world and the other in theirs, well, they can be anywhere and look like anything. The only common thread is nature. Now brace yourself, because I have 9, which is my favourite number, true accounts of strange and unexpected places that fairies use as doorways to come and go, and sometimes even allow one of us through. Have you ever seen one? And would you step through? As for me, no way. Although, you know, I always try to be open-minded. When faced with the temptation of it, caught up in that giddy excitement, who can say what any of us would do? But I can tell you what I wouldn't do, and that is mess with it. Can you imagine the fury of fairies who discover their gateway or portal chopped up or tampered with in any way? I shudder to think what they might do. Let's jump right into a dark one. In this person's experience, we see that when people interfere with a sacred fairy space, the fairy are quick to retaliate. In this case, the retaliatory actions escalated over time until it was clear that the fairies wanted the people gone once and for all. As a child, I had once or twice seen strange-looking winged creatures that I thought or hoped were fairies. Maybe they were insects, who knows? But we did have a tree in our yard that I am positive was a fairy tree. I don't know what type of tree it was, but it had very beautiful leaves, and I loved sitting under it. Whenever it grew too big or wide, my dad would get its branches chopped off. Then, within a few days, or hours even, something bad would happen in the family. For example, someone would get sick or have a nasty accident, or a healthy pet would die suddenly. Nobody seemed to notice this connection but me. I tried to warn my folks, but only my brother believed me. One day, the tree fell down in a storm and we had to get it removed. My dad died suddenly soon after, followed then by my mum. My brother wanted to sell the old place, but I disagreed. In spite of everything, I loved my childhood home and I wanted to live there. We ended up having a huge argument over it. The next day, my golden retriever puppy slipped and dislocated his leg while just chasing a ball. Then, 2 of my brother's cockatiels flew away when their cage door mysteriously popped open. All of this happened in 2020. The next year, 5 more of my brother's birds died, and in 2022, I suffered a life-threatening illness And that's when I finally gave in. At last, we sold our cursed property just late last year. I only hope that the bad luck ends with us and doesn't get transferred to the new owners. There was a park that was 22 minutes walking distance from the condo I lived in during high school. This park had 2 waterfalls that I would go by to just soothe myself really by listening to the running water. Sometimes when I went there I would write, but other times I would just meditate to be silent with my thoughts. I'd been going through some pretty heavy family things, and the park was the only place that I could really feel at peace. I remember it had rained the day before it happened. I'd always admired how brightly coloured everything was after rain, and I had felt a strong pull to go to the park that day. So I decided to go and sit in the waterfall, just seeing how it was such a nice summer day. Normally I would take the route where I would walk up an incline to get to the park, but that day I chose to take the entrance that had the sidewalk on it. As I got to the path with the woods area, everything seemed fine. Looking back on it, I'd say that there was an actual low pressure that I felt when I took that path. But I ignored it and continued on. There are clearings in 2 areas of this park. One is for bird watching and the other is a dog park. Well, I passed the bird watching area and noticed a doe grazing with their head kind of on a swivel, but they didn't seem too bothered by me. So I continued walking and got to the next wooded area. I was alone. There was nobody with me and nobody surrounding me on the other trails. The water from the creek grabbed my attention and I went towards it. I've done this many times before, so it didn't seem out of place at all. But kneeling down, I looked at the water as it flowed by, and I sort of sensed that I wanted to move on to the waterfall at once. As I returned to the path, I started to notice that there was a very distinctive arch made by 2 young trees. They were intertwined so tightly that they couldn't possibly be pulled apart. I wasn't sure if I should walk through them or not. My body felt sort of uneasy, but I was also really curious. And I was thinking, how could I have not seen this before? Was it even there before? I walked through the arch of the intertwined trees, and I made a point of looking back behind me as I entered, and everything looked normal. I went to the waterfall as usual and enjoyed my quiet time alone there, but the colours were even more vivid than usual, and it was so quiet. There was a stillness I'd never felt before. Eventually, I went back the same way that I'd come in and saw that the 2 young trees were no longer intertwined. They had unravelled and were back to what I guess was their original position. Nothing looked out of place, and there was no sign that they had ever been intertwined. I was feeling upset and depressed, very low that day when I entered the waterfall. I wonder, did my energy that day cause the Fae to create a temporary portal, or at least to show it to me? One time, in a field called the Grove, at Craig, County Donegal, which is still in this district, the fairies were often seen. In this field, there are trees growing. 2 of these trees are growing particularly close together, and it was known that in these 2 trees, the fairies stayed. Well, there lived an old man named Kelly in a house nearby the grove. One night, as this man was going to get water from a well which is in the field, he saw that those 2 trees were lit up. He stopped and looked at it and heard music and singing coming from the trees. After a while, the lights went out and the music and singing stopped. Another night, a different man was taking a shortcut through the field to visit Kelly when he heard a tiny voice calling several times, "Oh, I lost my wee portal." Well, the next day, this man climbed both the trees for to take a good look at them, but he saw nothing except that both trees were hollow. There is a rath in the corner of the field in the lowland of Carrantuil, and there is a ridge in the middle of the field, from one fence to the other. It seems to be the remains of a ditch which divided the field into 2 smaller fields. An old man who lived in the locality told me the following story. Matt Fowler and his wife Peggy lived in a little cabin near the rath. They had a few acres of land, a cow, and at the time I'm speaking about, they had a sow and 12 piglets. They used to have the sow and her young in the rath field in the daytime, along with the cow. So one May morning, who should ramble into their kitchen but a little woman that they had never saw before. "Will ye give me a drink of milk, good woman?" said she to Peggy, thinking she was a tinker woman and that if she was anyway civil to her, the whole band of tinkers would be around the house in a few minutes. Peggy said, "I have no milk to spare because I have 12 young to make up for the gain, and I must give them any sup and milk I have." "Well," said the little woman, "seeing as you have the piglets, I'll not be troubling you any farther, and as you have refused me a drink, I hope they'll thrive along with you," said she, with a dry grin on her withered face. She turned on her heel and out she went, but nobody saw where she went. Matt went out as usual that evening to bring in the sow and her young for the night, but you can be sure it shook him to find no sight or sound of either sow or piglets anywhere. After a frantic time searching, he heard a great roaring going on in the rath. So out he went into the gale wind up to the middle ditch and into the rath. Glory be to God, but when he looked in across the fence, there was the poor sow, and she running around inside the rath, and the roars coming out of her would terrify you, but there was no trace of the piglets. Matt called the neighbours to help him, and after what seemed a long time, they got her out of the rath. Well, after that, no matter how many fastenings or how many locks they put on the gate of that middle ditch, or no matter how they locked the pig house down at night, the sow would break through them all at night and go up to the rath and stay roaring around it till daylight. At last, the woman of the house could stand it no longer. She asked Matt to kill the sow and bury her, for she knew The misfortune had come on them on account of refusing the little woman the drink of milk on a May morning, for she surely was a fairy woman out of that raff. So it was. They killed the sow and buried her, but if they did, itself a queer thing happened after, for never would the gate in the middle ditch stay fastened. Some stout lads stayed up one night to see who used to open the gate, but I tell you, they didn't go twice. For when they were standing at the gate, to the minute of 12 o'clock, it swung open with a bang that shook the earth under them. And I tell you, they didn't wait to see who opened it, but took to their heels as fast as ever they could. Some time after, Matt knocked down the ditch altogether, for they had no luck at all. But the ridge in the middle of the field remains to this day, and is called the Middle Ditch with the Open Gate. Knockmar, which you see over there, is said to contain excavated passages and a place where the fairies live, and with them the people they have taken. And from the inside of the hill there is believed to be an entrance to an underground world. It is a common opinion here that after consumptives die, they are taken there with the fairies in good health. The wasted body is not taken into the hill, for it is usually regarded as not the body of the deceased, but rather that of a changeling. The general belief being that the real body and the soul are carried off together, and those of an old person from the fairies is substituted. That old person left soon declines and dies, while the other is there in Knockmar, living underground where the fairies are. This happened to me as a kid, and I still think about it a lot. At the time, I was about 12 or 13, I think, and I was doing a kayak trip down a river in a very rural part of France. This was an autonomous trip, as in we were carrying our tents and all of our stuff. We slept in the wild or in a campsite and went down a significant portion of the river as a group with other kids and a couple of adults. The region we were in was very wild, with deep canyon-like gorges and lots of old, deep nature everywhere. What I saw happened about 1 week into the trip, and it was a 3-week trip, so we were pretty far into the wild. We stopped for the night on a riverbank. I pulled my kayak onto the beach, I guess you could call it, then wandered a bit further just to check out where we might sleep. Just to explain the location, we stopped on a rocky riverbank that was slightly inclined towards a thick line of large trees with a clearing behind them. Well, suddenly, as I approached these trees, I felt extremely strange, kind of woozy, and felt compelled to look up towards these trees. I saw the clearing in between 2 trees with a very long open plain stretching out behind it, with a deep blue sky and the base of hills on the sides. This seemed strange to me, as there aren't that many plains where we were. Well, almost none, to be honest, and the view just seemed very surreal, like it wasn't the same time and space we were supposed to be in. It felt like a fantasy landscape, even though it wasn't really very different from some landscapes that I've seen. In the background, I heard a sort of musical piping but it felt very ethereal and, to be honest, weird. I could hear it very distinctly, yet it felt far away, like it was an echo. The closest I've heard to that sound since was hearing a high-pitched harmonica, but it wasn't exactly the same. What I heard sounded a lot more crystalline, pure. I stared at the opening in these trees for what felt like hours, but in reality must have been just a few seconds, until someone called me and I snapped out of it and looked away. When I turned back, the opening wasn't there anymore. It was just a regular clearing. No more plains or bright blue sky or anything. I honestly don't know what happened. I don't think it could have been a heat stroke or something like that, as I felt absolutely fine afterwards, and we hadn't even been that active that day. Weirdly, I've felt a sense of longing every time I think about those plains, like I was supposed to go in or something. I was almost 17. At my school, our PE classes happened in a gym with wooded areas nearby. I'd spend those classes with some book in hand, usually seated and reading. But there was a weird guy in my class, always full of bizarre stories and ideas, and I never took much notice of him. But this one day, he came into our gym class and he was almost euphoric. He had sneaked into a trail in the wooded area and came back with some purple dirt in a plastic vial that he said that he'd found in the fairy place. I said, yeah, whatever, dude, but he convinced some other nerds to go on an expedition with him the next week to this fairy place. I laughed their plan away and just left it at that. Well, next week, said group sneaked away and went to said place in the woods, and the teacher didn't even notice. And when they returned, they were all freaked out and euphoric. They talked about a grotto in a clearing with standing stones and said there were floating globes of light in this place. They said the dirt was covered in a pinkish purple substance, similar to what Weird Guy had brought us the week before, and I had readily mocked as some flower residue. As there were 5 witnesses this time who I thought were more reliable than Weird Guy, I didn't press the matter, but I just said, I'm coming with you next week, as I was actually really curious. So the next week came and I brought a small canteen, a snack bar and a small pocket knife. Weird Dude brought light sticks to use under plain sunlight, which I thought odd. He brought rope and a compass, and it was all in his green bag. Well, this time we were 4. There was me, Weird Guy, and 2 brave souls from the last week's expedition. We started by climbing some fences, guided by Weird Guy, and easily found the trail that he pointed to. He led the vanguard, and I was just after him. After about half an hour, we followed a thickly bushed path left off the beaten trail. Suddenly he gasped, "Look at this!" And the guy and the girl from the last expedition, they looked over to a dry creek that they swore was full of water the week before. There was a fallen log serving as a precarious bridge between the 2 sides of the creek. They all commented how the place looked like it had aged 50 years in just 1 week. Well, to help them out, I crossed the log with one side of the rope and tied it to a musky tree, while Weird Guy tied his side on another. Everybody crossed the log, and then they followed to what they called the portal. Well, the portal was basically 2 tall trees, but I understood what they meant by portal, as the thick trees had leafy limbs that met each other, kind of looking like an archway, and this led to a brief but stony slope. Again, they said that this portal looked like it had aged too. Well, feeling brave, I went up before them and started climbing the slope. The others followed me. I looked at my watch and it had stopped working. I was the only one to use a watch, so I asked the others what time it was. And to our surprise, all of our electronics weren't working. Weird Guy took out one of his light sticks. We didn't need it as it was bright. And he looked at it and looked at it, and it also looked like it was old. The liquid inside wouldn't even bend. It looked like it had dried up with age or something. I was a bit weirded out, but I kept climbing, and soon I got to the clearing that they spoke about. It was a rock formation, and the Standing Stones Grotto, as they had described it, was 3 stones, lightly rectangle-shaped, with one of them over the 2 others. Under the rocks there was this depression, kind of a 1-metre hole, and there was, I can attest, there were traces of the purple dirt on the ground. Well, as I was a better woodsman than they were, I quickly inspected the ground and found 3 semi-spherical depressions in the ground, forming together a triangular shape, each one roughly 3/4 of a metre from the other, like something heavy had been there. I looked then for the grotto and said, "I'm jumping down there." But as soon as I did it, bizarre things started occurring. First, I saw this red sort of stain in my peripheral vision, not unlike those wax seals on old letters, but without any markings or heraldry, of course. It was pretty annoying, and I didn't know what to think of it. But then the air suddenly had this stench. It didn't smell much like rotting meat. It was more like the stench of a garbage sack that was left for, 3 weeks bathing in the sun. It was so overwhelming that I became nauseous because of it, and I could see that the others smelled the same thing. Well, I climbed out of the cave a little clumsily, and my peripheral was full of those red stains of red something. I said to Weird Guy, "Let's get out of here." And he and the others agreed straight away, and we ran away from there in a very disorderly fashion. I was first to cross the log as this sense of terror took over us, and I helped the others to cross it. Then we kind of ran through the slope of the trail back to the gym. There we found our cell phones and other electronic stuff worked just fine. According to the others, that never happened before with them. There were no light orbs for me, just the stench, and apparently I was the only one to see those red spots. The experience they had the previous week was completely different. Well, I went home to lick my wounds that day, but after the initial fear had subsided, I concluded that I wasn't giving up on that place. 2 years later, I was able to recruit 2 of my friends to go back there with me, armed with a knife and a rope, and went back on the trail. Finding the left turn was easier than I had expected, and other than the log that was broken inside the dry creek, nothing seemed out of the ordinary this time. We climbed the slope and we went to the clearing, and I was fully expecting the same things to happen, but nothing happened. Our electronics were just fine. There was no stench, no purple dirt, no red spots in my peripheral vision. While we were investigating the place, I felt like I was being watched. It's a very useful instinct of mine, and I looked up to another path up a hill, and there were 2 men looking down at us, completely motionless. They were too far to distinguish any features, but both had about the same height. They were dark in shape and looked masculine in build. I held my knife up high to let them know that we were armed, but still they just stood there watching, motionless. We quickly retreated and the strange guys didn't pursue us, but last thing I saw were them in the same position, same place, just watching. And that was the last time I ever went to that place. I saw a fairy portal once and I almost went through it. I was 15 years old and it was the week before school was due to start. I was depressed about classes starting because kids had started bullying me. Well, my mum took me on a day trip to this local reserve. When we arrived, there was a busload of elementary school kids and my heart sank. I was noticeably chubby and kids were always cruel about it. This was the 1980s and fat phobia was real intense. Anyway, Mum and I walked along the main path and it was full of kids. My mum, she could instantly charm children, so they loved her, but when she wasn't looking, the kids would say mean stuff to me. I wanted to get away, so I wandered off the main trail and I found an old trail. It was very distinct in spite of a lot of undergrowth. It passed between 2 trees that arced toward one another, almost like a doorway. And then I came to this huge hedge. It was too high to see over, and it stretched all the way from the old trail back to the main path, seeming to sort of cut across the forest. Well, this old trail led right up to it, and there was a gap just wide enough for a child to fit through. I peeked inside and it was so lusciously green and cool, and it was a stifling hot day that day. Nebraska heat, humid and oppressive. So it was unusual to find someplace that cool in the forest, given all that heat and humidity. I squeezed into the gap and set my foot in the earth on the other side. It was soft and moist and springy, unlike the hard-baked, sandy earth of the main forest. And what I saw remains the most beautiful place I have ever seen. The sky was pearl blue. There was a vivid green bank sloping down to a dry creek overgrown with ferns. A huge fallen tree trunk spanned this ancient creek like a bridge, and on the other side was a forest of silvery trees, the most inviting thing I've ever seen. It was peaceful, wondrous. All the sounds from outside were hushed. It filled me with joy And at that time of my life, I had precious little that made me happy. Then I braced my hand on the outer wall of the hedge and had my other foot firmly planted in the hard, sandy, real part of the path, because somehow I knew if I put both feet in the fairy side, I could never go back. It was so hard not to walk into it and start exploring. I truly felt the place call to me, and I've never wanted anything so bad than to cross that tree bridge and explore that silvery forest. Even the air felt different. It was moist and sweet. I felt a light, gentle mist touch my face as I closed my eyes and breathed in deep. But then I thought of my mother. Could I really just leave her behind? She had a sad life too, and I thought it would be a gift to show her this place and we could go into it together. Well, as I had that thought, the gap in the hedge began to close, pressing against my stomach and my back. I felt forced to choose, go forward or go back. I pulled myself back out of it with an effort. The hedge branches caught in my t-shirt and tore a hole, and a branch scraped my arm, drawing blood. I went back down the old trail past the two trees entwined like a doorway and found my mother on the main path, still talking to those brats who had the nerve to bully me when she wasn't looking. I insisted to her that she come with me to see this most glorious thing. And she didn't doubt me, she was willing to follow me. Only now it was really difficult to find the old trail in the undergrowth. It was all overgrown and covered in leaves, but I found it and I made it as far as the two trees that were like a door, only they were strung with nasty cobwebs, like the trees were suddenly so old and ugly that I couldn't imagine going near them. And the trail, well, it had disappeared entirely. I looked up and pointed in the direction of the hedge, sure she could spot it from there. It was 9 feet high and stretched for several yards in both directions. But no, there was nothing, only the usual trees and undergrowth. I was shocked that it wasn't there. I could see then that it was impossible that it had ever been there. It would have dissected the main path, which was packed with children and teachers. I was speechless, trying to get my mother to understand what I saw. But she didn't doubt me. She said, maybe it was just for you to see. I felt such a profound feeling of loss, really inconsolable loss. Probably at the end of my days, I will still think of that place. That was my chance to enter the fairy realm, but I turned back. I've never shared this story before. I always thought if I had children that I would tell them about it, but that won't ever happen now, so I'm sharing it with you. I've always loved fairies, and my mum got me this book on them. It included fairy language, and it had a list of gifts to offer fairies should you wish to interact with them. Well, of course, I wanted to contact them, what young girl wouldn't? So for about a month, I wandered out to my backwoods and by a river, because according to this book, fairies like to hang out around water. And I would leave these little notes written in the supposed language from the book, along with little gifts and offerings too. I'd make them little leaf baskets. I'd leave them candy or flowers, things like that. I even recited a chant. I think part of me knew it was silly and that I'd probably never get results, but damn if I wasn't determined, so I just kept on doing it. At one point, my gifts and notes started disappearing from the bench that I left them on. I figured it was wind or birds taking it, but a small part of me hoped that it was something else. After a month or so of this nonsense, I was getting very discouraged. I decided to leave a few more gifts for them, but this time I weighed them down with small rocks so that they wouldn't blow away, and then I'd know for sure. Well, a day went by and my gifts were still there. Then another day, the same thing. Then, on the third day of checking, I found the gifts gone, but the rocks were still there. Only the rocks had moved around. I don't remember how soon after that this happened, but eventually I got what I had wanted. I wandered out to the woods and saw by the river 2 monarch butterflies. They were very large and, of course, I wanted to see them up close. However, one landed on a branch close to the path where I was standing, and I noticed that this butterfly had limbs, like tiny, thin, pale limbs, hands and feet. I stopped dead in my tracks and looked hard to make sure that I wasn't hallucinating. It was broad daylight and I could see very clearly it wasn't a butterfly at all. It was some kind of fairy. She had long, thin brown hair that went down past her feet and a little blue dress that looked like it was just a small scrap of fabric. But what terrified me above all else was her face. Her eyes were giant, black, alien-like eyes. But she definitely had a face, and she definitely saw me. I didn't even try to go and look at the other one because I ran. I was so scared that I bolted home and locked my door. After freaking out, I kept an eye on my backyard, which is the backwoods really, through my window. And then I decided to go back. No surprise, they were gone, and I never saw them again, despite me trying over and over again. My gifts were never taken. I felt sad and stupid because I felt like I had ruined my chance to have fairy friends. But knowing what I do now about fairies, it was probably a blessing that they left me alone. I really hope you enjoyed those 9 strange encounters. But before I let you go, I'd like to show you something. This gorgeous description of the places where fairies dwell, or fairyland as he calls it, is by American folklorist Evans Wentz. The only verdict which seems reasonable is that fairyland is a realm or place very much like, if not the same as, that wherein civilized and uncivilized men alike place the souls of the dead in company with other invisible beings, such as gods, demons, and all sorts of good and bad spirits. Not only do both educated and uneducated Celtic seers so conceive fairyland, but they go much further and say that fairyland actually exists as an invisible world within which the visible world is immersed like an island in an unexplored ocean, and that it is peopled by more species of living beings than this world, because incomparably more vast and varied in its possibilities. I just loved that. I really wanted to share it with you, and I'd love to read your thoughts on this below in the comments. I'd like to send out a big warm thanks to V, who recently supported the channel by buying me some coffees. And also welcome to our newest patron, Austin. V and Austin, I really appreciate your support. Thank you so much for getting on board. And if you enjoy my videos, please tickle that little thumbs up button. It loves it. And be sure you're subscribed. It's free. Until next time, stay curious. Cheerio.